I'm Caroline Hale, 33, and on Easter Sunday, my brother tilted a grin across the table and said, "Not everyone can handle a real career in tech." Silverware paused. Napkins froze, the roast ham steamed, while a small ache rose behind my ribs. I reached for the green beans and kept my face even the way I've practiced for years. Then my grandmother Ruth turned toward me with the kind of kindness that doesn't flinch and asked, "So did you buy his company because you felt sorry for him?" Chairs creaked. Someone set down a glass too hard. Owen's smile thinned, and I could hear my own pulse in the quiet. I looked at my plate, then up at every familiar face, and knew the story we'd lived with for years wouldn't survive the next breath. I opened my mouth. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from down in the comments. And if you've ever had to prove yourself in a room that decided who you were before you spoke, tap like and subscribe so this finds the folks who need it most. I grew up in a house where hard work was a given, and bragging earned you a raised eyebrow, not applause. At least that's how it felt until my brother started building things that made grown-ups lean in. Owen was the kid the neighbors called when their routers blinked out the one teachers praised with words like gifted and prodigy, while I learned how people process and timing decide whether great ideas ever see daylight. My parents loved us both, but conversations gathered around Owen, the way summer gnats find porch lights, and I learned to keep the peace, bring the lemonade clear, the plates nod along when my role at work got folded into something in marketing. I didn't argue because in our town keeping your head down was considered grace, and because I believed results would speak loud enough one day without me having to raise my voice. College took me farther than I'd expected. Scholarships and part-time jobs carried me west, where the skyline glittered with venture money and coffee-stained decks, and I found myself in rooms where decisions about people's livelihoods were made with dry erase markers and quiet conviction. The money, the pace, the vocabulary, everything moved faster than the life I'd known, but the values I carried from home fit just fine: do the work, share the credit, leave things better than you found them. What I learned, standing between engineers who spoke in systems and executives who thought in quarters, was that success isn't just code, it's translation. Someone has to listen for the gaps and build the bridge. Someone has to hear the hesitation behind a yes and fix what it means for the launch. I took night classes to read the models well enough to ask better questions, rose from project coordinator to strategist, and learned how to guide a product through turf lines without lighting a match. It was careful work, the kind that never makes a headline, and I liked it that way. At home, though, habits held. Holidays turned into demos, where Owen's latest prototype drew the circle tight, and any mention of my own wins slipped under the tablecloth next to the salt shaker. I told myself it didn't matter that the dinners were just dinner that the people who needed to know my worth already knew. Still, there were moments quiet late when the mismatch between who I was at work and who I was at that table felt like standing on a dock watching a boat that was mine sail under someone else's name. My grandmother Ruth would catch my eye sometimes and squeeze my hand as if to say she saw the whole of it, not just the part that fit the family story. By the time I earned the role I hold now, the rooms had grown larger and the stakes more exacting. The city hummed with its own kind of weather, and I stopped bringing work stories home unless someone asked, which they rarely did. I don't think anyone meant harm. Patterns don't check themselves, they just repeat until something interrupts them. The interruption came on a weekday morning with a list on my desk, a set of small companies to review for possible acquisition, a routine part of the job that keeps our long-term roadmap from drifting. I scanned the first page, circled a few promising notes, and then saw a name I knew so well it sharpened the print Owen's Startup right there in black and white. The world went very still, like the air before a thunderstorm. I closed the folder and watched the conference room glass reflect someone who looked steady, and I reminded myself of the rules I've lived by since I earned a badge for these rooms. Be clear, be fair, be brave enough to do both. I didn't say anything about the list at home, not yet. There are right ways to handle crossings like that, and I followed them even as older crossings tugged at me. Thanksgiving jokes about slide decks, birthdays where my title got rounded down into a word that felt safe, but wrong. Easter came a few weeks later, sunlight on a table crowded with people I've loved my whole life. Owen reached for a line he's used for years, And this time it landed with the weight of everything we hadn't said. Ruth asked her question, and the thread we'd all held onto pulled tight. I could feel it give, just a little like fabric about to tear in a place that needs mending. I drew a breath because there are moments when a family's story turns on, whether someone tells the truth out loud. And as their faces waited, I decided to set it down where everyone could see it, even if the room changed shape when I did. Growing up, there was never much doubt about who the star of our family was. Owen was the kind of child who made adults lean in and nod approvingly. At 11, he was already fixing computers and explaining routers like a professional. By the time he reached high school, he was winning coding competitions, coming home with trophies that gleamed on the shelf in our living room. My parents would beam at him, as if his success lit up the whole house. I'd clap too proud, but somewhere between the noise and the glow, I faded into the edges. When I was 16, I entered a state debate tournament and placed second. I remember walking through our front door, holding the small silver plaque, eager to share the news. Mom smiled from the kitchen, but didn't look up from stirring her sauce. Dad said, "That's nice, honey," before calling for Owen to come show him something on the computer. I told myself it didn't matter that I wasn't doing it for the attention, but the air had already gone out of my little victory. Even then, I understood the unspoken rule Owen's achievements were exceptional. Mine were expected. He left for college on a full scholarship to Caltech, chasing computer science and startup dreams. I followed 2 years later to Stanford, studying business and behavioral analytics. We were both in California, but might as well have lived on different planets. Our calls were brief, his filled with talk about prototypes and algorithms, mine about classes and late-night projects. He'd say things like, "That's cool," or "You should learn some coding," in the same tone people use when they're only half listening. I told myself we just had different paths, that someday our worlds might meet halfway. After graduation, he dove headfirst into the startup scene, and I joined a mid-sized tech company in San Francisco called Ceridian. It wasn't glamorous, but it taught me what the headlines never mention: the endless coordination, the budgets, the people behind every big product launch. I managed deadlines, smoothed out tension between departments, and learned that success in tech wasn't only about the code. It was about communication, about timing, about the 1,000 invisible tasks that kept projects from collapsing under their own ambition. Owen, meanwhile, was making waves online. His LinkedIn posts sounded like manifestos, bold visionary, a little arrogant, disrupting the grid, redefining energy efficiency, leading the next revolution. Our parents shared every article about him, even the ones that were just speculative. "You should be proud of your brother," Mom would say, forwarding me yet another link. I was. I truly was. But every time I congratulated him, he replied with a version of the same line, "Thanks, sis. You'd love it if you could handle this kind of pressure." It wasn't cruel, just casual. And somehow that was worse. The family gatherings became showcases. Thanksgiving, Christmas, birthdays. Each one a stage for Owen's stories about investors, conferences, and funding rounds. Dad would nod like he understood. Mom would laugh at the right moments. And I'd sit quietly filling plates or pouring drinks, watching the space I occupied shrink just a little more each year. I'd bring up something from work, a successful rollout, a new client partnership, and he'd say, "So you're in marketing, right?" The words landed lightly, but carried weight. To him, if it wasn't technical, it didn't count. Grandma Ruth was the only one who ever seemed to notice the small ways I dimmed myself. After dinner, when the noise faded and the dishes clattered in the sink, she'd find me on the porch with a cup of tea. "You do realize you're the only one who understands how things fit together, don't you?" she'd say. "That's what keeps the whole engine running." I'd smile, unsure how to respond. She'd pat my hand and whisper, "One day they'll see it, and you won't even have to tell them." Work became the place where I could breathe. I stayed late, took extra classes, learned enough coding to hold my own in engineering meetings. When someone needed a project rescued, they called me. When deadlines loomed, I was the one who found a way through. The recognition came quietly first, a promotion, then another. By 28, I was leading product strategy, translating complex ideas into something investors could believe in. The irony was that I spent my days proving how vital communication and planning were, yet couldn't seem to make my own family understand what I did for a living. One Thanksgiving, Owen arrived with his new wife Sabrina, a marketing consultant who carried herself with easy calm. She asked thoughtful questions about my work, genuine ones. I remember catching Grandma's subtle smile across the table. But the conversation soon turned back to Owen's company Grid Light. He described his algorithm, his investors, his roadmap. When I asked how his customer acquisition strategy was going, he laughed and said, "See, that's your world, Caroline," the people part. Everyone chuckled like it was harmless fun. I laughed too, but something in me folded smaller. Over the next few years, our paths diverged in public, but tangled in private. His name popped up in tech news often enough that colleagues would mention it casually, assuming I was proud. And I was mostly. But pride has a funny way of coexisting with exhaustion. Every conversation with my parents still ended the same way: "We're so proud of Owen." "Have you seen his latest project?" I'd tell them about mine, how my team just landed a multi-million-dollar rollout, but their smiles were polite distracted. "That's great, honey," Mom would say before turning to Dad with, "Did you send Owen that article on green energy funding?" At first, I told myself it was fine that families needed stars to orbit around. But as the years went by, my silence started to feel like complicity. I watched the narrative take root: Owen the genius builder, Caroline the supportive sister. I tried not to notice how my parents introduced us to friends. "This is our son, the entrepreneur," Dad would beam. Then, and our daughter, she does something in tech strategy. Something. As if what I built lived in the shadow of what he imagined. There's a particular ache that comes from being seen only in contrast to someone else. I carried it quietly through long nights at the office, through celebrations that felt half-earned, through family dinners where my place was set, but my presence went largely unnoticed. Grandma would still call me on Sunday mornings, her voice warm through the static. "Keep your head steady, Caroline," she'd say. "You don't have to shout to be heard. Just keep doing the work." Her faith kept me anchored even when the distance between what my family believed and who I truly was grew wider. Then one Friday evening, as I wrapped up a call and glanced at a new email from our acquisitions team, I saw a name that made me stop mid-sentence. Grid Light. Owen's company. My brother's dream sitting in a spreadsheet on my screen. I stared at it for a long time, the numbers, the metrics, the subtle red flags buried in the data. Something shifted, small but unmistakable. I didn't know then what that moment would lead to, only that the ground beneath our family's story had just begun to move. The file sat open on my desk like a secret that had finally found its way to me. Grid Light. Owen's company. I stared at the name until the letters stopped looking like words and started to blur into shapes. The report was part of our quarterly scouting review, a standard process to evaluate small firms for potential acquisition. I'd read dozens like it before, but never one that carried my brother's name at the top. The irony felt heavy. He had spent years talking about his startup like it was a rocket heading for the stars, and here it was quietly circling the drain in a spreadsheet under my supervision. I scrolled through the details, heart beating slow and steady. There were familiar traces of him in the product description, precise, clever, and technically ambitious. The problem wasn't the code, it was everything else. Rising burn rates, stagnant user growth, 2 failed funding rounds, and a leadership chart that looked more like a solo project than a functioning team. It was the kind of profile I'd seen dozens of times. Brilliant tech, no structure. I leaned back in my chair, letting the air out slowly, aware of the small, complicated knot that formed somewhere between sadness and duty. That afternoon, I walked down the hall to my VP's office and explained the situation. Conflict of interest, I told her. I knew the founder personally, and I didn't want my involvement to raise any questions later. She listened, nodded, and said she appreciated my transparency. We agreed I'd move into an advisory-only role, no negotiation, no decision-making. I'd simply observe the process and help shape the analysis where it was appropriate. It was the right call, but even so, the decision carried a quiet weight. It meant watching from the sidelines while a part of my family's story unraveled inside a corporate pipeline. The weeks that followed moved in a strange rhythm. During the day, I reviewed data and reports with the same focus I'd always had: Except now the numbers felt personal. The acquisition team dug deeper into Gridlight's financials and operations. Their findings confirmed what I already suspected the technology had promise, but the company itself was running on fumes. Owen's team was overworked and underfunded. There was no marketing director, no dedicated COO, no clear growth strategy. For all his talent, he'd built a machine that couldn't sustain itself. Evenings were harder. Family dinners came and went, filled with the same stories I'd heard 100 times. Owen talking about strategic partnerships that didn't exist yet, Dad nodding proudly, Mom passing him another helping of potatoes. I'd sit beside Grandma Ruth, feeling her quiet gaze. Once after dinner, she leaned toward me and said softly, "You're holding something you can't say yet, aren't you?" I looked at her, unsure how to respond. She patted my hand. "Don't worry. Truth has its own timing." It was the kind of thing only she could say without sounding like a riddle. At work, my team finalized the report. Gridlight's codebase was sophisticated. His predictive models for energy management were among the best we'd seen, but the business was collapsing. Beaconwave, my firm, was interested in the algorithms, not the leadership. The acquisition proposal made that clear. They'd buy the assets, retain the engineering staff, and dissolve the current management structure. In other words, Owen would lose control of the company he'd built. My name appeared in the documentation only as part of the initial review committee, small and forgettable. Still, it was enough. It was more connection than I wanted to have when the news reached him. The night before the acquisition call, I sat at my kitchen counter with Daniel. He was reading on his tablet, half listening as I spoke about a company we might buy soon. I never mentioned Owen's name. I couldn't. Daniel looked up and said, "You've been quiet lately. You sure you're okay?" I nodded and smiled, though my chest felt heavy. There are times when the right thing professionally and the right thing personally aren't the same thing. I went to bed that night knowing that by morning, a decision would move forward that would change everything between my brother and me. When the internal memo came through confirming Beaconwave's intent to acquire Gridlight, I stared at it for a long time before closing my laptop. I didn't send a message, didn't call, didn't warn him. The process was confidential, and even if it hadn't been, he wouldn't have listened. He never had when advice came from me. Instead, I did the only thing I could: show up at work, do my job, and brace for the storm that was coming. 2 weeks later, Mom called to remind me about her birthday dinner. "Everyone's coming," she said cheerfully. "Owen has big news." I could hear the pride in her voice. I smiled, said I'd be there, and hung up before she could ask anything else. That evening, I walked into my parents' house to find the table already set, candles lit, laughter filling the kitchen. Owen stood near the window, talking animatedly about new opportunities and potential partners. The words sounded familiar, almost rehearsed. He glanced at me as I entered. "Hey, Caroline? You might actually be interested in this next phase," he said with a grin. "It's the kind of thing people in your line of work appreciate." He meant it as a tease. I nodded, keeping my expression even. Dinner unfolded like every other family celebration. Owen commanding the conversation, Dad listening like a devoted fan, Mom filling plates, and the rest of us orbiting quietly. Grandma Ruth sat near the end of the table, eyes watchful, lips curved in a faint knowing smile. I caught her looking at me once the same way she did when I was younger, and trying too hard not to cry. I looked away, focusing on the wine glass in my hand. After dessert, the conversation shifted to Beaconwave. Owen was talking about his company's potential acquisition offers when Grandma leaned toward me and said lightly, "Caroline, dear, isn't that where you work?" Her voice was mild, but her timing was surgical. Owen paused mid-sentence, just long enough for the air to change. I smiled faintly and said, "It is." He nodded quickly and continued brushing it off as coincidence. Grandma didn't push. She never did. But later, as we stood by the sink helping with dishes, she whispered, "You can't hide forever. Secrets have a way of finding daylight." That night, driving home, I replayed every moment at that table, the pride, the assumptions, the familiar imbalance. I realized how much of my life had been spent making myself small enough to fit inside someone else's story. The silence that used to feel like safety now felt like surrender. Still, I said nothing. Not yet. There's a particular quiet that settles before something breaks, like the air itself holding its breath. I felt it everywhere, in the hum of my car, in the glow of the dashboard, in the steady pulse beneath my hands on the wheel. Something was coming, and this time I wouldn't look away. The night after my mother's birthday dinner, I stayed late at the office. Most of the building was dark except for the floor lamps glowing in a few corner offices. I opened the final integration brief for Gridlight and read it again from start to finish, as if the numbers might change this time. They didn't. The report confirmed everything Beacon Wave would move forward with the acquisition. My brother's company would be absorbed, its assets folded into our larger energy initiative. His algorithms were the prize. His leadership wouldn't be part of the deal. I leaned back and stared out at the city, at the moving dots of headlights streaming across the bridge. Somewhere out there, Owen was probably telling our parents about a partnership that no longer existed. He didn't know yet. The official announcement wouldn't reach his team for another week. I tried to convince myself it wasn't personal. It was business, clean, structured, professional. But beneath that logic was a hum. I couldn't quiet a sense that something long buried between us was about to surface, whether I was ready or not. The next morning, I joined a call with the acquisitions committee. My role was strictly limited now only to verify strategic alignment and risk. Still, every sentence about Gridlight felt like a stone dropped in water. Strong technical foundation, one director said. Questionable scalability, another added. Someone else mentioned inefficient resource allocation, which was corporate language for poor management. Each phrase hit with a weight that made it hard to breathe. When the vote passed unanimously, the chair thanked everyone and moved on to the next agenda item. Just like that, years of my brother's work became a bullet point in a quarterly report. That night I told Daniel what had happened. We were eating takeout on the couch when he asked Will, "Your brother find out you were involved?" I hesitated. Eventually I said, "My name's in the documentation." He nodded slowly. "He's going to take it personally." I didn't answer because we both knew he was right. The following week, Beacon Wave's leadership sent out the internal press release, Strategic Acquisition of Gridlight Technologies. The email was polished, full of optimistic phrasing about innovation and synergy. I read it 3 times before closing my laptop. My phone buzzed almost immediately, texts from colleagues congratulating me for my smart call on identifying the opportunity early. They didn't know what that opportunity cost. Days passed, but the silence from my family stretched on. Either Owen didn't know yet, or he was pretending he didn't. I caught myself checking social media, scanning for any mention of the deal, but his profile stayed unchanged. Then one evening, Mom called to remind me about Easter lunch. "Everyone's coming," she said brightly. "Your brother's bringing a new prototype demo. You'll love it." I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so familiar. The show would go on. When Easter arrived, the house smelled like baked ham and lemon glaze. The dining room was dressed in pale tablecloths, pastel flowers, and the kind of cheerful calm that only exists before something breaks. I helped Mom carry dishes to the table while Owen held court in the living room, explaining market shifts and potential investors to Dad and Uncle Jerry. From the doorway, I watched him, his gestures confident, his voice steady. He didn't look like a man whose company had just been sold from under him. Maybe he didn't know. Maybe he refused to. We sat down to eat, the clinking of forks filling the silence between polite questions. Owen started talking about the energy sector again, about how his company was on the verge of something big. "Not everyone can handle a real career in tech," he said with a grin, aiming the words at me like it was just another joke. The table laughed, some out of habit, some out of discomfort. I kept my eyes on my plate, cutting into the green beans, letting the moment pass like I always had. Then Grandma Ruth set down her fork and looked straight at me. "Caroline," she said evenly, "is that why you bought his company?" "Out of pity." The room went still. The sound of the air conditioner was the only thing that moved. Owen's smile faltered. Mom froze with her napkin in midair. I didn't speak right away. My pulse was steady but strong, like it knew this was a line I couldn't cross back over once I started. I set my fork down and met Grandma's eyes. "I didn't buy it," I said quietly. "Beacon Wave did." The silence deepened, sharp and waiting. Dad blinked. "I don't understand," he said. Owen's jaw tightened. You're saying you were part of that deal? I nodded once. I led the initial analysis that recommended the acquisition. He laughed once short and strained. You're kidding. You don't even work in acquisitions. No, I said. I work in strategic planning. Acquisitions fall under my division now. His face changed confusion, disbelief, then something close to anger. You mean you knew about this? You knew they were buying my company? I declared a conflict, I said. I wasn't part of the final negotiation. His voice rose. But you started it. Before I could answer, Grandma spoke again, calm and sure. She didn't buy it out of pity, dear. She bought it out of competence. The words landed like glass breaking. No one spoke. I looked around the table at the faces I'd known my whole life. Dad's confusion, Mom's shock, Sabrina's quiet sympathy. Owen's hand trembled slightly as he set down his fork. So this is what you've been doing, he said slowly. Working behind the scenes to take over my company. That's not what happened. I said, my voice low but clear. Beacon Wave wanted your technology. They didn't want the business as it was. I didn't manipulate anything. I followed protocol. He stood so fast his chair scraped against the floor. You've always been jealous, Caroline. Always waiting for me to fail so you could swoop in. I rose too, though I kept my voice level. If I wanted you to fail, I wouldn't have flagged Gridlight at all. That acquisition kept your team employed. It kept your work alive. The tension rippled across the table like a live wire. Mom whispered his name, but he didn't hear her. You took everything from me, he said, shaking his head. You made sure that if I couldn't lead, no one else could. Grandma set her napkin down. Enough, she said, firm, but not unkind. Your sister didn't destroy anything. She made sure your work survived your mistakes. The room fell silent again. Owen stared at me, chest rising and falling, then turned and walked out through the kitchen. The back door closed hard behind him. No one spoke for several seconds. Grandma reached for her water glass and took a sip unbothered. Well, she said softly, truth has a way of clearing the air. No one laughed. Not yet. The air felt raw, stripped clean of everything that used to hold it together. I stayed seated, my hands flat on the table, feeling both lighter and heavier than I'd ever felt. Outside, through the window, I could see Owen standing near the edge of the yard, shoulders rigid, his figure framed by the fading afternoon light. I didn't move to follow him. Not yet. Some truths need silence before they can be mended. Inside, Mom dabbed her eyes. Dad pushed his plate away, and Grandma refolded her napkin with slow, steady hands. The hum of conversation slowly returned quieter this time, cautious but real. It wasn't peace, not yet, but it was the first honest breath we'd taken as a family in years. I looked out the window one more time, the sunlight turning gold against the trees, and knew the next step wouldn't be about proving who was right. It would be about finding what was left to rebuild. The screen door creaked softly as I stepped out onto the porch. The sky was beginning to turn gold, washing the yard in a quiet light. Owen sat on the top step, elbows resting on his knees, staring toward the street. He didn't look up when I joined him. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the faint hum of the neighbor's lawnmower down the block. She really said that, huh? He finally asked. Grandma. She did, I said. He let out a breath somewhere between a laugh and a sigh. She's always liked you more. I shook my head. She just sees both of us clearly. Always has. He ran a hand through his hair and leaned forward again. You humiliated me in there. I didn't plan to, I said quietly. But when you said what you said, I couldn't sit there and pretend anymore. He turned toward me, his expression tight. That line about a real career in tech, I've used it 100 times without thinking. It's just something I say. That's the problem, I said softly. You never thought about what it meant or how it landed. He looked away, the light shifting across his face. I've been telling people for years that you do marketing. I didn't know. You never asked, I said, finishing the sentence for him. He rubbed his palms together slowly. Why didn't you ever correct me? I thought for a moment before answering. Because it always turned into a competition and I didn't want to fight you. I thought staying quiet was easier. He looked down at his hands. Yeah, well, silence has a way of building walls, doesn't it? For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The wind brushed through the trees, and the scent of baked ham still hung faintly in the air from inside the house. Finally, he said, "How bad was it, Gridlight?" I asked. He nodded. "Bad enough," I said gently. "The tech was great, Owen. But the business side was bleeding out. Your burn rate was too high. You were 3 months from layoffs." He didn't respond right away. I could see him processing it, his jaw tightening, the muscles in his shoulders stiff. "I knew we were in trouble," he admitted after a while. "I just kept thinking one more deal, one more investor, and I'd fix it. That's what founders do," I said. "You believe in the dream. You hold it so tightly that you don't see what it's costing you." He looked over at me, eyes tired but steady. "You really led the team that flagged my company." I did, I said. I recused myself from the final vote, but yes, I made sure the evaluation was fair. I wanted your work to be seen for what it was, not what people assumed it could be. "So you saved me," he said, a trace of disbelief in his voice. "I saved your work," I said gently. "The tech deserved a future, even if the business couldn't stand on its own." He nodded slowly, letting the words sink in. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small stress ball with the Gridlight logo printed across it. He turned it in his hands like something fragile. "I don't know how to be second," he said quietly. "I've spent my whole life being the one who leads, who knows everything. Now I'm working for the same company that bought me out. You're not second," I said. "You're just not alone anymore." He looked at me, then really looked, and the edge in his expression softened. "You know I've been a jerk," he said. I couldn't help the small smile that tugged at the corner of my mouth. "An arrogant, brilliant, exhausting jerk," I said. That made him laugh for the first time that day, a short, real laugh that felt like something beginning to heal. When we went back inside, the air was different. Conversations picked up in fragments, cautious but trying. Owen slid into his seat beside Sabrina. I sat down between Grandma and Daniel. Grandma raised an eyebrow as if to ask, "Is it over?" I gave her a small nod. Uncle Jerry tried to lighten the mood with a story about getting lost on a fishing trip. Aunt Colleen laughed too loudly at the punchline, but the sound broke the tension just enough. For the first time, no one seemed afraid to breathe. Mom glanced down the table at me, her eyes soft but puzzled. "Caroline," she said, "why didn't you ever tell us what you really do?" I hesitated, unsure how much to say. "I guess I stopped thinking anyone wanted to hear it," I said finally. Dad shifted in his chair, guilt flickering across his face. "That's not true," he said quietly. "Maybe not," I said, but Owen's stories always filled the room. There just wasn't space for mine. Owen looked down but didn't interrupt. Grandma placed her hand over mine. "That ends now," she said. Daniel, seated beside me, spoke for the first time all evening. "Caroline's team doesn't just follow trends," he said gently. "They set them. She's been leading one of the top strategic divisions in the country for years." Aunt Colleen blinked. "Really?" Grandma smiled. "Yes. You all thought Owen was the only tech prodigy in the family, but it turns out Caroline's been building something far more lasting." Sabrina nodded. When I saw her name on the integration brief, I looked her up. Her work's incredible. I didn't realize she was behind so many of Beacon Wave's biggest projects. Even Dad looked stunned. "I had no idea," he said softly. "Sweetheart, I'm sorry. We should have asked more." I smiled at him, not with bitterness, but with quiet relief. "We all got used to the version of the story where Owen was the star," I said. I stopped trying to edit it. Grandma raised her glass of water like a toast. "Here's to rewrites," she said. Everyone chuckled softly, the sound lighter this time. Something old had cracked open at that table, and something new was just beginning to form. As Mom passed the dessert, Owen cleared his throat. "I owe you all something," he said. The table fell still again. "Especially you, Caroline." I looked up, unsure what he'd say next. "I didn't just ignore your career," he said. "I minimized it. Because if I admitted how far you'd come, I'd have to face the fact that I wasn't the only one who mattered." His voice wavered slightly. The words were simple, but they carried a weight that filled the room. "You deserve every bit of recognition," he said. Not because you're my sister, but because you earned it." The air felt different after that. The kind of silence that doesn't sting it settles calm and whole. I blinked hard, the lump in my throat catching me off guard. It wasn't a perfect apology, but it was real, and for the first time in years that was enough. Outside, the light was fading into a soft blue, the last glow of the evening slipping across the window. Grandma's laughter rose softly from the end of the table, mixing with the clink of dishes and the murmur of half-finished conversations. For the first time in a long while, it didn't feel like two families, his world and mine. It felt like one cautiously learning to start over. And though I didn't know what came next, I knew the silence between us had finally broken, and that was more than enough to begin again. 3 months later, Owen and I sat across from each other in the Beacon Wave cafeteria. Between us was a tray of half-eaten sandwiches, a couple of coffee cups, and a stack of scribbled notes covered in his handwriting. He was explaining a redesign to one of Gridlight's core algorithms, his hands moving as he talked. "If we refactor this section here," he said, pointing to a diagram, "we can cut processing time by almost 20%. I smiled. "That'll make our enterprise clients very happy." He grinned, the first hint of confidence I'd seen in a while. Especially the energy group we just signed. His enthusiasm was different now, quieter, steadier. The sharp edge he used to carry in every conversation was gone. Working together had been awkward at first, both of us adjusting to this new version of our dynamic. He was still proud, still meticulous, but for the first time, he listened. I glanced down at the paperwork on the table, his integration proposal for Beacon Wave's next software release. The Gridlight technology had been fully absorbed, rebranded, and expanded. The project had a new name and a new budget, but Owen's fingerprints were still all over it. A group of analysts walked by and waved. Morning Caroline, one called out, "Nice work on the strategic roadmap." I nodded, offering a polite smile, then noticed Owen glance their way. For a second, he looked uncertain, like he was still learning where he fit. He set his pen down. "You really built something here," he said quietly. "So did you," I answered. He studied me for a moment, then gave a small nod. "Still feels strange," he admitted. "Going from leading my own company to working inside a bigger one. It's humbling." "Humbling isn't the worst thing," I said with a faint smile. "It's how most of us learn." He laughed softly. "Yeah, well, I've had a lifetime of skipping that lesson." The conversation drifted into comfortable silence. The clatter of lunch trays and the low hum of conversation filled the space around us. Through the tall windows, sunlight spilled across the tables, casting bright patterns on the floor. At first, our collaboration had been tentative. He was defensive, I was cautious. But little by little, something shifted. We began to build trust, not the kind born from blood, but the kind earned in long hours, quiet compromises, and shared goals. Our parents visited the Beacon Wave campus a few weeks later. Mom carried a container of homemade cookies, beaming as she offered them to anyone who passed. Dad looked around the open office with wide eyes, shaking hands with engineers and asking what a tech stack was. When they saw our names on the leadership wall, mine under strategic planning, his under technical integration, Dad took a step back and exhaled, like he was finally seeing both of us clearly. At dinner that night, for the first time in memory, they asked about my work before they asked about his. The change was small, but it carried a kind of grace. Owen noticed it too, though neither of us said anything. A week later, Grandma Ruth invited us over for Sunday pot roast. The table was smaller now, just the two of us, our parents and her. After dinner, she set down her fork and looked between us with that same steady expression she'd always had. "You two remind me of code and interface," she said, folding her hands. "Different layers, same purpose." Owen laughed. "She means we finally make a good team. Don't get cocky," I teased. Grandma smiled, her eyes soft with pride. "I just like seeing balance again." Later, while clearing dishes, Owen leaned against the counter and said, "You know, I used to think leadership meant being the smartest person in the room." "It helps," I said with a small grin. He chuckled. "Sure. But now I think it's about listening to people who see what you can't. That's what you've always done." I met his eyes. "We're still building." He nodded. "Yeah. But this time not alone." That conversation stayed with me for days. It was the first time Owen had ever spoken about teamwork without defensiveness. the first time he'd truly acknowledged what it meant to lead beyond himself. By early summer, we were scheduled to present our first joint roadmap at the company's town hall. The auditorium filled quickly, engineers, designers, executives, even a few investors. As I stood backstage with my notes, I watched Owen rehearsing under his breath, that same focus he'd always had, but calmer now. "You ready?" I asked. He glanced at me, smiled faintly. "I think so." "You always," I said. When we stepped on stage, the lights felt bright but not blinding. I began with the strategic overview, our goals, timelines, and growth projections. Owen followed with the technical breakdown, explaining how the new predictive models would improve efficiency across BeaconWave's platforms. The audience was engaged, nodding, taking notes. For the first time, we weren't competing. We were completing each other's sentences, building on each other's thoughts. It wasn't sibling rivalry, it was partnership. When we finished, the room erupted into applause. Afterward, as we stood in the wings, Owen turned to me and said, "You know, for someone who's just in strategy, you're kind of brilliant." I raised an eyebrow. "You're only figuring that out now." He laughed. "Better late than never." The rest of the afternoon moved in a blur of congratulations and handshakes. As the crowd thinned, I found a quiet moment to breathe. I looked out at the empty chairs and thought about how far we'd come from silence and misunderstanding to something that felt like respect. That evening as I drove home, I called Grandma to tell her how it went. She listened quietly, her voice warm when she finally spoke. "Sounds like you both found your rhythm," she said. "We're getting there," I said. "That's all life ever asks," she replied, "to keep building even when you start over." The road stretched ahead, washed in the soft light of sunset. I thought of Owen's laughter, of my parents' pride, of the strange peace that had settled between all of us. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And somewhere deep down I knew this wasn't just about a company or a career. It was about what we'd built from the ruins of our old story, something stronger, steadier, and entirely our own. Still, life has a way of testing what's newly mended, and though I didn't know it yet, that test was closer than I thought. The months after our presentation settled into a rhythm that felt almost peaceful. Owen and I worked side by side on the project launch, trading notes, solving problems, and even sharing the occasional late-night coffee in the office kitchen. Our collaboration drew attention across departments not because we were siblings, but because we made an effective team. He handled the architecture, I handled the direction, and somewhere between his precision and my planning, we found balance. One Friday afternoon, as we wrapped up a meeting with the integration team, Owen turned to me and said I never thought I'd enjoy working under someone else's umbrella. Turns out I was wrong. His voice carried an easy humor, the kind that used to feel rare between us. "You're not under it," I said. "You're holding it with me." He smiled, shaking his head. "Still, it's a good umbrella." By early summer, BeaconWave announced a company-wide showcase for our division, a chance to unveil the fully rebranded grid-light technology now powering the firm's newest product line. It was a milestone that marked not just the success of the acquisition, but the survival of everything Owen had built. He was asked to lead the technical demo while I handled the strategic launch overview. It would be our first public appearance together since Easter. The morning of the showcase, the auditorium buzzed with quiet energy. Rows of seats filled with executives, investors, and teams from every department. The air smelled faintly of coffee and fresh printer ink. As I stood backstage adjusting my microphone, Owen approached, smoothing the cuff of his shirt. "You ready?" he asked. "Always," I said. He grinned. "Let's make Grandma proud." The lights dimmed and the introduction rolled. I walked on stage first, outlining the growth strategy and vision for sustainable energy systems. The words came easily now, steady and certain. Then Owen stepped forward, explaining how his predictive models now powered efficiency tools used by major corporations. His tone was calm, focused, humble. The applause that followed was warm and genuine. When the session ended, a few executives came over to congratulate us. "You two complement each other well," one said. "It's rare to see technical brilliance and strategic insight mesh like that." I thanked him, glancing at Owen, who gave a modest nod. It struck me how far we'd come from the days when he would have claimed all the credit. Now he simply looked relieved and proud. Later that afternoon, the company hosted a small reception in the atrium. I found Grandma Ruth sitting near a tall window, her cane resting against her chair, a glass of sparkling water in her hand. "You know," she said as I joined her, "I've lived long enough to see a lot of things, but watching you two share a stage might be my favorite." I smiled, pulling up a chair beside her. "We've learned a few things." "About time," she said with a teasing grin. Then her voice softened. "You gave that boy a gift, Caroline. You didn't humiliate him, you saved him from himself. That's harder than it sounds." Before I could respond, Owen appeared behind us holding 2 plates of dessert. "Are we talking about me again?" he asked. "Always," Grandma said. "You were the family headline for 30 years. It's hard to break the habit." He handed her a plate and sat across from us. "I can live with that as long as Caroline's in the headline, too." The 3 of us sat quietly for a while, watching people drift in and out of the room. It wasn't the kind of silence that needed filling. It was the easy kind, the kind that meant things had settled into place. That evening, our family gathered at Grandma's for dinner. The house smelled like roasted chicken and rosemary. Mom fussed over the table settings. Dad opened a bottle of wine, and for once there was no edge beneath the laughter. Even Sabrina looked relieved. She caught my eye across the table and smiled, a small nod that said everything without words. Halfway through dinner, Dad raised his glass. "To both of you," he said. "You've made this family proud." Owen looked down embarrassed. "It took us a while to figure it out." Mom reached over to squeeze his hand. "That's what growing up is for," she said softly. Grandma lifted her glass too. "To balance," she said. "To knowing when to lead and when to listen." Everyone echoed the toast, the clinking of glasses, gentle and warm. Later, as the dishes were cleared and conversation mellowed, Owen leaned back in his chair and said, "I've been thinking about something." Grandma looked up. "That sounds dangerous." He smiled. "No, really. I've been thinking that maybe Gridlight wasn't supposed to stay mine. Maybe it needed a bigger home. I used to think losing control meant failure. Now I think it means trust." The room grew quiet, the kind of quiet that holds respect. He turned to me. "You taught me that." I didn't know what to say, so I just smiled. Dad cleared his throat, his voice gentle. "I wish your grandfather were here to see this," he said. "He'd be proud of both of you." Grandma nodded, eyes glistening, but steady. "He's here," she said. He'd say the same thing. I'm about to say it takes courage to build something real together after years of competing. Most people never get that chance. Owen looked around the table, his expression thoughtful. "I guess we were both building walls when we could have been building bridges." "You built both," Grandma said. "But now you know which one to keep." The evening wound down slowly, laughter returning in soft ripples. As we said our goodbyes at the door, Grandma kissed my cheek and whispered, "This was the justice you needed, not revenge, but recognition. You earned it." Outside, the air was cool and clear. Owen and I stood side by side on the porch watching our parents drive away. "You know," he said after a moment, "I used to think you were lucky for staying quiet all those years. Turns out you were just patient." I smiled faintly. "And you were determined." He nodded. "Guess we both turned out okay?" We stood there a moment longer, the porch light humming softly above us. In the distance, the sound of crickets filled the night. For the first time, we weren't brother and sister defined by comparison. We were equals finally standing on common ground. Still, life doesn't pause for happy endings. There's always another chapter waiting to be written. As I drove home later that night, headlights sweeping across the familiar road, I realized that healing didn't erase the past. It simply gave it context. And that was enough to carry us into whatever came next. The seasons turned again, and before I knew it, another fall had settled over the city. The air outside Beacon Wave carried the scent of rain and cooling asphalt, and through the tall windows I could see the river reflecting a thin silver light. I'd just wrapped up the final review of our joint roadmap, mine and Owen's, and was waiting for him to join the call. When he arrived, still slightly out of breath from running late, he grinned like he used to when we were kids trying to sneak in after curfew. "Sorry," he said, straightening his tie. "Traffic was a mess." I laughed, shaking my head. "You're fine. We're ahead of schedule." That meeting marked a quiet milestone, our first full year of working together since the acquisition. Gridlight was no longer just a line item in a quarterly report. It had become one of Beacon Wave's cornerstone projects, employing hundreds and influencing how corporations manage their energy systems across the country. Owen had earned respect on his own terms again, not as a prodigy or a founder, but as a leader who finally knew how to listen. After the meeting, I found him standing by the window looking out over the city. "Remember when we used to argue about who'd change the world first?" he asked. I smiled. "Looks like we both did, just not the way we imagined." He nodded, hands in his pockets. "You know, I used to think success was about being the loudest voice in the room. Turns out it's about knowing when to share the mic." That line stayed with me long after we left the office. It summed up everything the past few years had taught us: how recognition means little without understanding, and how sometimes the truest victories are the ones no one claps for. At home that evening, Daniel was already cooking when I walked through the door. The scent of roasted vegetables filled the kitchen's soft music playing in the background. "You look lighter," he said, handing me a glass of water. "I think I am," I told him. "It feels like the noise finally settled." He smiled. "Took you both long enough." We ate quietly, the easy kind of quiet that doesn't need words. Later, as I washed the dishes, my phone buzzed a text from Grandma Ruth. "You've built peace, not just progress. That's the real inheritance." I stared at her message for a while, smiling at how she always managed to say exactly what I didn't know I needed to hear. A few weeks later, the whole family gathered at her house for Sunday dinner. The air smelled like cinnamon and pine, the first hints of the holidays beginning to appear. The meal stretched long into the evening stories, laughter, gentle teasing. At one point, Grandma raised her glass and said, "This feels right. Took us a few decades, but we finally got here." Everyone smiled, even Owen, who added, "Took some tough board meetings, too." Mom reached over to squeeze his hand, her eyes glistening. "I'm proud of you both," she said. "Not for what you built, but for how you built it together." After dinner, as the family drifted into the living room, Grandma called me to the kitchen. She was wiping down the counter, her movements slow and careful. "You did what I hoped you'd do," she said softly. "You broke the pattern without breaking the family." I leaned against the counter beside her. I wasn't sure it would ever happen. "That's the thing about change," she said, setting down the cloth. "It doesn't ask for permission. It just needs one person brave enough to start." When I left her house that night, the air was crisp and the sky was clear. I stood on the porch for a moment, watching Owen load leftovers into his car, Sabrina laughing beside him. For the first time, I saw him not as competition, not as the family's favorite, but as my equal, a man finally learning to live without the pedestal that once defined him. As I drove home, the road stretched quiet and familiar, the city lights flickering in the distance. My life didn't look like the version I once imagined, but maybe that was the point. Somewhere between ambition and forgiveness, between proving myself and letting go, I'd found something steadier, dignity, balance, and a voice I no longer had to fight to use. Now, when people ask what I do for a living, I don't shrink my words. I tell them I lead teams that help ideas find their place in the world. It's not flashy, but it's real. And it took me half a lifetime to understand that being seen isn't about spotlight. It's about standing in your own truth long enough for others to adjust their eyes. If you've ever had to rebuild your worth after being underestimated, I hope you know this. Silence isn't weakness. Sometimes it's the foundation for strength that doesn't need permission. And when the time comes to speak, the world will listen because you'll finally be speaking as yourself. Thank you for listening to my story. If it resonated with you, take a moment to share it with someone who needs to be reminded that grace and justice can coexist and that it's never too late to build peace on your own terms.